Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the 42 Rugby Weekly. Gavan Casey here, joined as always by Murray Kinsella of the 42 ahead of this brilliant-looking November. Murray, how are you? Are you excited?
I'm very excited. I've actually obviously seen the Ireland team, but I've also seen the France team. Dupont, Ntamak, Jalibert and Ficou's the 9, 10, 12, 13. Like, that is as juicy as they come. I can't wait to watch them play. Japan team, obviously exciting as well, and plenty to talk about in this Ireland team.
Yeah, we're going to dive straight into the Ireland team. I say straight in a moment. I have to say hello firstly to Bernard Jackman. Bert, how are you?
Good, thanks, Gav.
Brilliant. We're going to chat as well to Rich Freeman later on. He's going to give us the thoughts from Japan. He is a Japanese rugby expert. Looking forward to that catch up between Murray and Rich. And later on as well, towards the end of the show, we're going to look ahead to November and the future generally through the prism of some of the developing rugby nations and see which way the wind is blowing for a number of them. That Ireland team, Murray, has just been announced as we record, so you guys have had about 25 seconds to observe it. Is it about what you expected, and did it meet the rumours that had been, that tend to circulate in the lead up to team announcements?
Yeah, I mean, the expectation was a very strong Ireland team, kind of prepping them for the All Blacks game, as well as respecting Japan. And it's definitely along those lines. The big surprise kind of yesterday that filtered through, maybe not big surprise is wrong, but James Lowe is back on the left wing. You thought about them needing a left footer with Stockdale missing, so it's probably going to be himself or Zebo. And Lowe gets a nod there, as well as Conway on the right. I think longer term we would have anticipated that Keith Earls would be in that slot as well. So interesting selections on the wing. I had a couple of wrong ones in my prediction. Certainly at hooker I had a sense that Herring was going to be there, but Ronan Keller gets the nod and tees himself up if he plays well to start against the All Blacks, and Dan Sheehan is on the bench for his debut, which is really exciting. Obviously selection, he's such an athlete, as we've discussed. He's got major potential. And Rob Herring is the one to miss out, the guy who's been a bit of an incumbent there and reliable around set piece and low error count. So I think that's a brave selection from Farrell in that sense. But overall, I think a lot of people will probably be a little bit disappointed there's not a greater sense of testing out his squad in this November window. We discussed someone like Kieran Frawley. I was really hopeful that we might see him just to know whether that model can work. But he's gone for Aki and Ringrose to try and get them, I suppose, a bit of momentum before they take on the All Blacks, and that's been the story with Ireland. It's winning now. There's certainly bits of development there, like Sheehan, and some really exciting talent. Kelleher starting, Caelan Doris getting more experience, that kind of thing. But I kind of understand how some people will be disappointed not to see a greater element of trying things out in this window.
Just to start with your old area of expertise, Bert, well, still an area of expertise, and your dartsman, Rob Herring, not included. Instead, it's Ronan Keller to the Aki. Are you surprised that Herring isn't included at all? Or, without meaning to sound cruel towards Herring, is that a sign of development or experimentation that Farrell is potentially looking to the future with Sheehan on the bench? Just that little bit of greater dynamism off the bench, I guess.
Yeah, I think we're very lucky. We've got three very good hookers. Obviously, as Murray and yourself said, Herring is a set piece specialist, and but then you've got two really explosive, exciting ball carriers in Kelleher and Sheehan, and I think it's probably one of those ones where Herring either starts or he doesn't feature. And I wouldn't be overly surprised if Herring started against the All Blacks if the set piece shows, any sign of weakness this weekend. I'd be shocked if Paul, went into the All Blacks game with any doubts around, being able to win quality ball. And I think Herring at the moment is just a little bit better in that area. But I think the two lads are better rugby players, and that's not better rugby players, but more explosive in open play. I think this front row is as good as any front row in the world in terms of all three's ability to play in open play. Obviously, three of them are power athletes as well. Set piece, scrum should be very, very good, and and you've got Dan coming off the bench hopefully to add to it. So I like the front row. It's probably, if I'm being perfectly honest, when I saw the three, all the international teams I think are out now. England's out as well. Obviously, Marcus Smith has missed out because he hasn't been able to train in terms of starting. But it was probably Marcus Smith that I was looking forward to seeing. It's the Japanese team with Fafita, Matsushima, Riley, and it's France as Murray said. So the Irish team, while I absolutely respect all their qualities, it probably hasn't got me super excited. Now that's probably nothing to do with individuals. It's probably because there hasn't really been a significant development in our attacking game. There was glimpses of it in the summer, but obviously that was against probably not Japan were full strength, but certainly in America aren't the kind of the litmus test for your attacking game. So I'm excited. I'm excited to see what we do with our frontliners. But yeah, it's probably based on the last 2 seasons. No real massive development in terms of our attacking game, and I don't think we have to. I don't think we'll win our game with attack. It'll be how we defend and what squeeze we can put on them in set piece. But realistically, for us, we're getting closer to another World Cup. We're getting closer to a Six Nations. We're getting closer to a very difficult tour of New Zealand next summer. Without a huge amount of strings to our bow in terms of an all-around game plan, I think.
Well, the profile there is, Birch, just to follow in on that, the profile there in the pack, Birch, is that we should see that development now. You've got Porter at loosehead, a guy who's obviously explosive, athletic, but he's got skills in terms of handling and picking passes. Furlong, obviously, we know that. Keller is well capable of offloading when he wins those collisions. Ty Byrne in the second row is like a playmaker. And we've seen James Ryan pushing his game in that regard. It doesn't definitely come as naturally to him. The back row is really skillful in what they can do. Jack Conan, we saw him go all the way to starting the 3 lines test, and they probably actually didn't get enough out of him in terms of what he can do. And Doris is a similarly complete player. So there is no excuse for us not to see that now. If you're throwing in more experimentation in your squad selection, I think there'd be more of an understanding around not getting a really strong performance. But Ireland absolutely need to deliver that now by naming such a strong team. I am excited by that pack. Obviously there's a level of familiarity there, but at the same time, Porter hasn't been a loosehead, and I agree with Birch. I actually think Porter could be possibly the best loosehead out there. The scrummaging side of it will be a challenge, of course, and Japan have worked hard on that area, but he's just got so many attributes that were probably a little bit wasted as the backup tight head. Keller, obviously extremely athletic, and the whole profile of the pack is that they're mobile. They're probably the players that you thought of when you saw Andy Farrell coming in as the head coach and what he would look for. So there's plenty of excitement in that, but it's about them actually being used in the right manner and not just bludgeoning away, but being pushed and pressed and encouraged to use that skill set as well. The 9 selection is interesting. Obviously, Conor Murray isn't match fit. He's only played 22 minutes, but we know that Farrell is a huge fan of what Gibson Park brings, his skill set around that 9 role, the ability to snipe, the ability to decision make on the move towards the ruck, and it's a massive game for him. If this goes well, he has a shot maybe at the All Blacks, his native country, and loads of players he'd be really familiar with. It'll be a massive couple of weeks for him, and again, it'd be brilliant to see his skills really harnessed and that have a big influence over how Ireland play.
Yeah, just on that, I'm a Man United fan for my sins, and Man United have loads of brilliant players as well. There's no doubt, but we don't really see at the moment a real clear plan to how to use them together, and it's a little bit like I've no doubt when Johnny plays, there will be structure to it, and we will have a better chance of seeing all those players, particularly forwards, footballing ability, power, because he will do a huge amount on the field to make sure they're set up correctly. It's just, what are they going to be like if Johnny's not there, if Johnny's injured, and how much of it's down to his ability to stay fit. That's the question, I think. So for me, for example, if Japan play next week with Saito and Matsuda, they'll still play the same way. You know what I mean? If we play next week with Joey or
Harry Byrne,
will we play the same way? I don't know if we will, and that's the question. I could be completely wrong. Maybe we will. Maybe we've moved on to the level now where everybody is very comfortable with how Ireland play, what our philosophy is, and I hope we are. If we are, then we'll have a great chance. We'll have a great team. If we're not, we'll be a little bit hit and miss and a little bit inconsistent.
Isn't it unbelievable how the conversation around Sexton has morphed, Murray, over the last couple of years? Because even before the last World Cup, in our heads, not just the three of us, but rugby fans around the country, we were making our own succession plans for the upcoming World Cup, right? And the presumption was that he would have aged gracefully and probably ridden off into the sunset by this point, despite the fact that he was saying he wanted to emulate Tom Brady. I'm not sure how serious he is about literally going to 45, probably not that serious, but definitely wants to keep going until he literally can't anymore, right? And okay, I would argue he's not quite as good as he was during his World Player of the Year pomp 2018, but he's not a million miles off it. The concern is probably stringing games together for him, which is becoming more difficult. I don't know, is that due to age or just due to general wear and tear? And yet he is still, and I don't think anybody would disagree listening or on this call, by far and away our best out half. And probably will be. Like, there's not enough evidence to suggest that he will drop off between now and the World Cup. Would you agree with that?
I think it's an impossible question to answer and predict, because you just don't know when someone athletically and in terms of what their body can do just stops and declines, because it happens quite quickly in the end, often with older players. I agree at the moment, 100%. You wish the World Cup was sooner so that you'd definitely have him there, and that's a guarantee. I know already he's thinking about that next contract to carry through to the World Cup, and as he said, they'll try and do that after Six Nations time. And it'll be no great shock to see that happening. All the language around it, all the communication is that he's the captain, he's driving this forward, and World Cup is very much on his and Farrell's mind. But you just worry about, as you say, history repeating itself. Like, it's crazy that we're having the same convo that we had all those years ago, and there's still no answer. And that's why, again, this November window is important. It's obviously not going to happen this weekend, but like, Joey Carberry has to get a start against Argentina in that game and get a chance to run the team at 10. Again, this would have been a great window, but as I said, Farrell's thinking about getting momentum into his team, and the fact that Sexton is the best out half. Definitely, there needs to be a concerted effort to make sure that if he goes down or gets injured, or his body quickly gives up, or whatever the phrase for that is that someone else is ready and experienced and has had exposure recently to pressure situations and big games, and that the teammates around him have also had that exposure to him, because you don't want one injury to completely derail everything around the team, and that's definitely still a valid concern.
Birch, with players growing old or deteriorating physically through age, like, I'd argue, I know what Murray is saying there. Sometimes a player can grow old literally overnight. Mickey Ward, the boxer, spoke about growing old between rounds in his third fight with Arturo Gatti. Literally a minute and he felt like an old man. But with Sexton, I'd argue he already has physically deteriorated in a very natural way, not especially perceptible maybe to the naked eye, but he's not 100% the athlete he used to be. And I guess if it follows that trajectory, and if he's able to keep himself on a reasonably even keel, there isn't, like, I suppose what I'm asking is, if as Murray says, he could just drop off a cliff one day between now and the World Cup, then this is one of the great gambles of all time in Irish rugby. Do you think they're viewing it the same way?
I actually think it's really important we absolve Johnny of any blame in this. I mean, it's not his fault that he's still by a million miles our best 10, and sometimes some of the narrative people talk to me on the street is like, it's his fault he's still there. Like, all he's doing is preparing himself in the best possible way, playing as well as he can, and he's 25% better than everybody else. So like, we're lucky we have him at the moment. I actually don't think his body his game was never based on like sheer athleticism. Like Marcus Smith, you know, his game is based on his ability, his speed off the mark. Obviously, his speed of thought, but realistically, it's his speed that makes a difference. Bowden Barrett the same. Like Johnny and Dan Bigger and Owen Farrell, like they don't operate at the level they operate based on any gift of genetic gift, in my opinion. They're obviously good athletes, but it's mainly their ability to see the game, their decision making, their game sense, their ability to motivate, their ability to organise others, their catch pass, their kicking, etc. So their goal kicking. So I actually think he could stay at the level he's at in a year, another year, or a year or two after that. But the challenge is obviously you can't just be reliant on him, and unfortunately that's been the last 6 or 7 years. And I know there's various reasons why Joey hasn't come through, mainly around injury, etc. But yeah, just unfortunately we haven't found another two who are not have to be as good as him, but close to him. And the team can play at a reasonably close level when they play. And it's fascinating to see. I mean, there's lots of talk in England at the moment about George Ford and his form, but I can see why Eddie Jones doesn't have him in for November, because George Ford's personality could potentially harm the development of Marcus Smith, because he's an alpha male. He wants to be the 10, and his form gives him a legitimate shot of getting game time or getting reps of training. So it makes sense for Eddie Jones to leave him out. But if you're Eddie Jones, you know George Ford is there at the end of the phone. If you need him to beat a Southern Hemisphere giant, or to win a Six Nations game away to Ireland, etc. So that's the challenge for us, is we haven't done that. We haven't been able to do that, and that's worrying. It's worrying in a system where everything is aligned and everything's about Team Ireland. We have failed miserably over the last 5 or 6 years to know who the backups are, and like, I'm not. Jack Carty's obviously, people could say he's similar to George Ford in that he's in great form, and Andy Farrell knows he can bring him in. But for me, it's not the same. It's not the same. I mean, there's a sense that Andy Farrell doesn't trust Jack Carty, or he hasn't had the opportunity to do it at international level as often as George Ford has. And yeah, I know there's a bigger playing pool in England, but there's also a lot of moving parts. We are one system, and I think if anything does happen to Johnny and we fail in our targets because we haven't clarity in terms of who the next best 10 is, the system has failed rather than the individual player.
Just to broaden it out very briefly, Gav, you kind of look at numbers 20 and 23 on the bench, and this is no criticism of Peter O'Mahony and Keith Earls. I think they both obviously have proven themselves at international level. I think O'Mahony has started the season really strongly. Earls has been unfortunate in playing at 13, where he's not getting the run of the ball. But we know what their qualities are. We know everything about them, but we don't know what Gavin Coombs and, say, Robert Balakoon's qualities at this high level are. It just feels like maybe this was a window to see that. And listen, let's judge it after the campaign, because there is that Argentina game to come, and you would hope and expect and be very disappointed if that wasn't a game where they give that kind of player, who I think it's very clear has international test level ability and even game-changing ability. Ryan Baird, another one, because you don't have many windows. You really don't, and they're talking about 2023, so they want to be judged on that, and you've got to give these guys an opportunity somewhere.
Well, like, with apologies, to bring it back to out half just a moment, and to interlink it with what you're saying there, Murray, the fact that you don't have many windows, because I'll be crucified if I don't ask this or bring it up. Like, again, the fact that there's absolutely nothing to suggest from recent years that Johnny Sexton can make it through an entire World Cup campaign unscathed or really remain fit for the entire thing. And like, that's again not his fault. He plays incredibly abrasively. He's been playing the game for an incredibly long time. Even allowing for the fact that you could potentially rest him for a couple of pool games, it's just, we haven't seen it, I suppose, him string together like consecutive games for a very long time. And with a shortening window, ever shortening now, to actually integrate a potentially decent backup, like, we're staring into serious trouble here as far as I can see it. And I just want to talk about it now rather than again after the World Cup going like, shit, yeah, we got that wrong,
Yeah, I mean, I think myself and Birch have kind of expressed that concern. He obviously did put a few games together in the last Six Nations and was the best out half, I thought, in that. So again, you're trying not to focus on him. Definitely, I think we've both said that this is a concern, but yeah, it's just disappointing that you might get a situation where history repeats itself. So yeah, there'll be all focus on Japan this weekend. It's going to be a class fixture, but you look down the line and that's where you have that trepidation, definitely.
But short term, our best chance of beating the All Blacks is with Johnny having played this week and having some kind of cohesion going into next week. That's the short term argument.
If only World Cups were short term. I suppose South Africa made it a little bit more short term last time, didn't they? Bert, I know you've been studying Japan, and we're going to chat to Rich Freeman, or at least Murray is, in a moment. But how excited are you to see them match up against Ireland and just watch them generally? Like, what are you expecting from them this weekend versus, say, what you would expect from Ireland?
Yeah, well, I just think they're all on the same page in terms of, and they've built this over since 2016 when Jamie Joseph and Tony Brown took over. They have remodeled their attacking philosophy, and they are predominantly an attacking based team, and it's they use the analogy of the Shinkansen, which is incredibly fast and leaves or arrives at a train station to the second rather than to the minute or late, and that's basically their model. Is they get in position faster than everybody else. Everybody knows their role, and then they implement the Tony Brown blueprint, which has gone away from structured attack. So just an example, in 2015 under Eddie Jones, when Japan had a very good World Cup, unlucky to miss out on qualification, had 3 wins in their group but lost out in bonus points. Obviously beat South Africa and Brighton. They scored 9 tries and none of them were from unstructured attack. So they were all based around set piece possession. And then in 2019, their split was 6 from structured, 7 from unstructured. And they have a massive focus on ball and play time, but that doesn't mean they're slaves to keeping the ball in hand. So possession time actually over the last 3 World Cups has decreased, but the ball and play time has gone up. So what does that mean? They're happy to kick the ball away, but they kick incredibly well. They keep the ball on the field the majority of the time, and they manipulate the backfield before they kick. So it's difficult to do anything with that possession. So what teams generally do is they kick it back, and then Japan will look to exploit that early, or else they'll go back into their mode to find space in the backfield and kick again. And the high ball and play time fatigues defenses, and as soon as they see a mismatch, they have the speed and evasion and skill to take advantage of that. So it's high tempo. It's interesting. There's a lot of different wrinkles, and I saw Murray did a piece on some of their attack against Australia. And it's fascinating. It's highly complex. I would actually argue that some of their structured attack is nearly too complicated. In that sometimes they create opportunities and play another phase because it's pre-programmed, and that opportunity is gone. But that's the way that's like, I know foreign coaches coaching there, and I mean, if the session isn't 2.5, 3 hours, it depends on your manager. So a lot of the corporations will impose a manager on you, and the manager sometimes insists on very long training sessions. But because they're so long, they do a huge amount of repetitions of set piece attack in the club game there, or the factory or the company game. Whereas at international level, I think Tony Brown's got a better mix. But yeah, like they may score off a set piece try this weekend, and if they do, it'll probably be a thing of beauty. But I don't know if Murray agrees, but I do sometimes think they make it overcomplicated. But certainly their unstructured attack is very smart, and it'll be fascinating to watch. We got caught. They could score 31 points against us in June. I thought their defence was very poor, particularly in terms of defending the seam of the line out in the scrum. And we made good inroads there. We were smart in terms of that. But I'd be shocked if they were weak defensively again. And as I said, I think the fact they scored 31 points against us will have Simon Easter be pretty worried this weekend.
Murray, you caught up with Rich Freeman. Take it away.
Yeah, he's a gent, a guy who showed us around Tokyo a little bit during the World Cup, and we had some good times with him as well. But yeah, just caught up with him on the selection, on where Japan have been and their lack of rugby, and also kind of future plans for the competition domestically over there. There's been changes, so great to catch up with Rich. Rich, thanks a mil for talking to us. Firstly, how is life generally in Japan at this stage of what has been a long couple of years?
Yeah, it's been a tough couple of years. Life's getting back to normal. The numbers are down. Fortunately, a lot of people are vaccinated, and they're talking about opening up most of the stadiums soon. So we're slowly getting back there.
That is good news. We've a bit of rugby to distract us anyway this weekend, and we've just had the teams named. Firstly, from Japan, obviously catching our eye that Matsushima's back in there, Tamura, these guys that we're familiar with. Any surprises from your point of view, and what do you make of that selection?
Well, the big surprise is Dylan Raleigh on the wing. I mean, you've got 4 centres in the back line, and you've got 5 back row forwards in the pack. Now, whether that's by choice or just simply because of the injury problems that they have, that's the one thing that really strikes me is those selections in particular.
Riley, what can we expect from him? He's not one we would have known, obviously, at the World Cup.
No, he's a young player. He's been up here 3.5. He's one of the sort of the 3 young Panasonic guns, Ben Gunter, Jack Cornelson, and Dylan Raleigh, all coming under Robbie Deans' sort of tutelage at Panasonic. very, very good outside centre. And that would be ideally where he'll end up playing for Japan for many years to come. It's a bit of a shock to see him on the wing. I don't know if he's ever played on the wing. He certainly hasn't played on the wing in the top league in the 3 years that he's been up here. So, but a very good football player.
Yeah, I'm sure that Ireland will give him a little bit of a test, and vice versa with James Lowe coming back in on the left wing on this side of the water. What is the kind of general perception from Japan around this fixture? Obviously, Japan beat Ireland at the World Cup in 2019. It feels like not that long ago. Different game here in July. How are the confidence levels, and what's the expectation, I suppose, from Japan?
It's difficult to say because this is only the fourth game Japan have played since the World Cup. That's what people have got to remember. I mean, there was talk about Australia were rusty and that's why they only just beat Japan a couple of weeks ago. And I'm like, well, hold on a sec. Japan have hardly played a thing since the World Cup. Obviously, it's away from home. That makes it a lot harder. It's, as an interesting selection. There are some young guns in there. It's a transition period with the next World Cup coming up. Everyone still obviously talks about the game at Shizuoka during the World Cup. Obviously, Japan want to prove that July was a little bit of a glitch and that they want to get back to winning ways against a Tier 1 nation.
It must be really hard to assess, given that lack of games, that whether rugby has kind of kicked on from the World Cup. Is that the sense there in terms of the legacy of the comp?
Well, yeah, because, obviously with the top league, the year after the World Cup, it got stopped because of COVID. And then because the year after this year, it was under sort of closed stadiums pretty much most of the time. So the whole expectation has basically been done on social media. That's where most people are still talking about rugby. That's where, there is still a great deal of excitement over here. People still sort of, obviously the World Cup 2 years away, but it's been a tough 2 years for Japanese rugby. Not the 2 years I think they wanted following such a good World Cup.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really difficult that you can't build on that. Has there been much talk about the future? Obviously, Joseph and Tony Brown in particular, who was really wanted by the All Blacks, sticking around, probably says a lot about where they see it going. Is 2023 looming on the horizon, or is it just about getting back up and running?
I think initially it was about getting back up and running, and I think that's why some of the names that were being picked for the squad, especially earlier this year, with the Lions and Ireland, were names that were sort of familiar to Jamie Joseph from their time with the Sunwolves. Now, obviously, they're sitting there and realizing it's just 2 years to go to the next World Cup. There are some big names, obviously, that aren't playing this weekend. There's some new young guns that have been picked, and it's still an awkward stage of how far do you to get rid of someone like perhaps Utamura or Michael Leach, but how much do you need them to bring on some of these young players that they have?
It's so funny. We just had that discussion on our podcast around Ireland and when the right moment is to I suppose, make that step. Just to go back briefly to the likes of Riley and Gunter and a few other guys you mentioned, Moore, Cornelson, like what's the debate around that in Japan? Because project players is always a big thing in Ireland and people discuss it, and players who come through the Irish system. How big a talking point is it over there?
The Japanese people don't mind at all. The only complaints I've seen have been in languages that are not Japanese, basically. I think you'll probably remember from the World Cup, the two biggest roars from the crowd when the team got introduced were generally Michael Leach and Luke Thompson.
Yeah.
So the Japanese fans, probably some of them are sitting there wishing that maybe there were a couple more of their sort of favourite or hometown favourites playing, but they take to the foreigners that have been here, especially, you've got to realise because of COVID, a lot of these guys, Dylan Riley, Craig Miller, they stayed up here the whole time. They didn't go back to Australia or New Zealand. They stayed up here because it would have meant time away from the country. So the Japanese people respect that. They respect the fact that they've given so much to their club teams and they want to play for Japan. And so most people in Japan, every now and again you get one or two that will sit there and go, too many gaijins or whatever. But generally, they just accept the fact. And a lot of these guys, Ben Gunter was a day away from joining the Australian Army. His whole real senior rugby has been under Robbie Deans at Panasonic. Tim Lafayette obviously was at university here. A lot of the Tongan boys were at university over here. So people sort of realize that they've given quite a bit to Japanese rugby already and they deserve a run in the jersey.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw how, I suppose, some of those guys have become massive figures in Japanese rugby and are really wholeheartedly loved by the supporters in 2019. There is going to be a change domestically. There's the top league transforming into League One, which I'm going to confuse with football over on this side of the world. But whatever about the name, it seems like a new dawn, Rich. What's the story there?
Ideally, it would be a new dawn, but unfortunately, things might not progress quite as much as I think a lot of us hope. The idea was that there was originally going to be 12 professional franchises in the World Cup venues. That got dismissed. Then there was talk of another competition running alongside the top league. That got dismissed. And what we've been left with now is pretty much a continuation of the top league. The companies still have considerable power. They did not want to get rid of that power. Particularly two very big name companies were very insistent that they wanted to carry on almost as they were before. Now, at the moment, one of the biggest concessions is each of the team have to have a place name in the hope of trying to regionalize things. The problem is we have now 6 teams with Tokyo in the name. So Tokyo fans are a bit confused. We have one team that James Moore plays for, which is called, and I'll give you its full name, NTT Communication Shining Arts Tokyo Bay Urayasu, which even their captain apologized for its length at the recent press conference. So, yes, the teams are starting up academies. That will work. But the whole idea of professionalism, we'll have to see how that goes.
Like, why?
They're certainly getting the big name players, though.
Yeah, they continue to, absolutely. And it's been brilliant to see some of the clips, and the rugby looks like it's growing. Why the need to change? The companies have been seen as a negative influence, or what's the thought there?
I think one of the reasons was just trying to build, ideally was to build on the legacy from the World Cup. Soccer made this transformation back in the 90s before the Soccer World Cup was held over here, and they totally transformed the way that football or soccer, whatever you want to call it, was played and supported. And so they developed in smaller towns that didn't have baseball teams, and suddenly those teams were getting 20, 30,000 people to a game and really developing the sort of the community spirit. I mean, where I live in Yokohama, we have a baseball team, but we have a couple of soccer teams. We have a third team now that's just entered into the professional leagues, and you'll see banners for the soccer teams everywhere. And I think rugby realized that being just purely company-based, it was hard to attract fans. That was one of the reasons the Sunwolves did so well. Suddenly the Sunwolves, it wasn't your duty to your company. It was this was a team that Japanese people got behind because it represented them. So wherever you came from in Japan, they supported the Sunwolves, and they had a great fan base. And I think that's what, rugby are trying to do. But as I say, the companies have still got that tight hold on things.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that grassroots level, because that's so important away from the limelight. And we talk about Irish rugby in this sphere a lot as well. Like, what's your experience on that side of thing? Are younger kids taking up the game? Is there a good pathway there?
There was a huge increase in the number of players after the World Cup. And the problem was that I don't think they were prepared for it. The rugby school that is very close to my house, they just were inundated with kids. They didn't have enough coaches. They were worried about insurance. They didn't have enough playing space on the field for all the kids. The problem is the actual structure of rugby still has not changed. And just to give you an example of that, last week we had a tournament in Saga Prefecture, one of the counties in the southwest, that determines the winner of that tournament goes to the National High School Tournament, which is in its 101st year this year. It's a massive tournament played over the new year. High school rugby, 30-minute halves. The final of this prefecture tournament, 213-0. So when you have that, you realize the system needs to be fixed, because there's just too many kids here that will give up the game at 18. And so to answer your question, the pathway still doesn't exist. They'll all be taught tag rugby, but then there's very few junior high schools that they can then learn real rugby. And the clubs at this stage, there are no junior clubs. I mean, that's one of the things the new league is supposed to provide, is an academy. But obviously, if it's an academy, it's only going to be the really good kids. It's not going to be the late developers or kids that just don't have an interest in rugby till perhaps 16 or 17.
Fascinating. Sounds like there's loads of work to do so there, and we'll be interested to see how it develops. I suppose to wrap, like at the top level, we're all loving watching Japan play. Fingers crossed they can get into the Rugby Championship or whatever format that comp might take. What about this weekend, Rich? What are you expecting? Any prediction for us?
I was just, as I say, I looked at the benches and I think that sort of sums up, unfortunately, what might happen this weekend. Because you look at the Irish bench, you've got a guy there with 109 caps, you've got a guy with 63 caps, 76 caps, 89 caps, 93 caps. And then you look at the Japan bench and they've got some very young players. They've got no second row on the bench. They've got a sevens player who's listed as the reserve lock. I hope Japan do well. You know, obviously they play that brand of rugby that everyone loves to watch. And obviously as a rugby fan, you want Japan always to do well because they play that great style of rugby. But you just look at the teams at the moment and you think there's a big difference there.
It's going to be fascinating. Listen, Rich, thanks so much for talking to us late your time over in Yokohama. Really appreciate it. And we'll catch up again soon.
No problems at all, mate. My pleasure.
Yeah, great to catch up with Rich Freeman on Japan. And Japan are very much a model country as it pertains to our next conversation. Murray, we're going to chat about some of the developing nations, tier 2 nations. It's a phrase I kind of just don't really like for some reason, but those countries that are trying to play catch up and looking ahead to the next World Cup, trying to ascertain who may or may not have an impact. There have been changes on a sort of a macro sense or in a macro sense with the eligibility rules potentially being changed, I should say. There'll be a vote on that at the end of this month. So where do you want to start? Because this is a pretty global chat. So what has caught your eye over the last few months in terms of, I guess, the development of the global game and some of these developing countries?
Well, there's so much to get into here, but I suppose the key for me is that this area of the game is one of the big challenges for the sport. Like, if rugby is going to take the next step, we need more competitive nations at the top table, making a World Cup genuinely competitive, greater than 5 or 6 nations, whatever it's been, the traditional powers who you know are going to be in the mix. We need more nations winning games in pool stages at World Cups, making it more competitive and just driving the standard. And that is the challenge for rugby. There's loads of nations out there with potential. And I agree with you on the term tier 2. It makes me slightly uncomfortable because you're creating a divide straight away there and a sense of them not being at the top table. I think rugby as a whole needs to work really hard to integrate and accelerate the development of nations. And that's a tough thing because everyone wants to keep their place in the pecking order. They worry about dropping behind other nations if they develop, but it needs a kind of unified approach to make the game bigger and broader with more bases, with new markets and just, yeah, everyone talks about growing rugby, but for me, this is the big part of it. I suppose there's been loads going on behind the scenes, and that's the thing. You get to the World Cup, and often you're not aware of how teams have even got there. A big one recently was Uruguay qualifying into the World Cup. Canada and USA had a bit of disappointment. Canada actually aren't going to make the World Cup now for the first time ever. They lost out. USA still have a chance. They're going to play Chile in a qualifier with the winner of that going into the World Cup as America's too. And that was a brilliant performance from Chile to beat Canada, like a more established power. I know, Bert, you did the comms for the game. I watched it back. Brilliant comms, by the way, with Ron Nugent.
In Spanish as well.
Yeah. but it was thoroughly deserved, Bert. Wasn't it? Like, Chile are one of these nations now who are developing and showing real signs of growth.
Yeah, I thought it was outstanding, and the passion, the skill set they had. There's been big developments in terms of the competition structure down there. So they're getting better quality fixtures. They had funding to go into a long camp, and it just showed you what they can do when they have proper prep time. And I'm looking forward to seeing them play obviously USA next year in a knockout game to go to the World Cup, or a knockout set of games to go to the World Cup. But certainly on the evidence I saw and what I've seen of America lately, you'd have to fancy Chile, and that's what I think is great, is that anyone who stands still risks being left behind. And unfortunately, Canada and USA have, well, not fortunate. Unfortunately for them, they have stood still. They haven't been able to capitalise on being in those World Cups, which does drive revenue and hopefully grows the game. And teams like Uruguay and Chile, obviously Uruguay beat Fiji in the last World Cup, so they have been there, but they haven't had any easy rides. And I just think it's brilliant to see South American rugby seem to be on the right track. And, you know, obviously then if we look a little bit closer to home, in terms of European rugby, you know, can we develop the game into Germany, Spain? Obviously Georgia are probably the nearest to being able to break into that top 6 in Europe. But that's like, I would say that has to be the next step for World Rugby. And I know there is money being put into it, but I suppose Chile and Uruguay are probably the best examples of what we've seen recently to say, look, we can, with proper strategy, get these teams up to speed.
And just on that, Gav, can I jump in? It's a worry, I suppose, for Canada and USA to look like they're moving backwards at that level. I do think Major League Rugby actually proving itself as viable and still existing, to be honest, at this stage, several years on, is really positive. That domestic side of it is massive. We'll probably talk about international competition, the likes of Japan, Fiji. They need greater opportunity at the highest level. But what's happening underneath, probably again away from the limelight, is really important. And that's why I look at South America and their Superliga Americana, the rugby competition now. They got a second season away proper this year after that pandemic kind of ruined the inaugural year. But you have teams from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and
Colombia, I think.
Colombia as well. And Jaguares 15, the Argentinian side, they won it. They were really dominant. They beat Penarol from Uruguay in the final. But that kind of development is really positive for rugby. I watched a few of the games on streams and the quality was good. And you would hope that that'll accelerate and develop over the next couple of years. Because, yeah, I think Georgia is a great example there, Birch. They are clearly ready. Like a country that loves rugby, they've got government support, they've got facilities, they've got real desire to be integrated at the top table. You'd love to see them in a Six Nations or whatever format that would take. But I also think it'd be great to see a domestic involvement from them. I don't know if it's a URC second division potentially. And you look at the Rugby Europe Super Cup, again, a club competition beneath the limelight that played off this year with some European nations from those kind of tier 2 sides, I suppose. Lusitano's 15 from Portugal have been really good, as have the Georgian team, Black Lions. Like, how cool would it be if the URC could integrate that competition, maybe some of the other South African sides like the Cheetahs who want to be in there as well and involved, and you get a kind of 2-tier league. I know that would make it even more wide-ranging than it already is, which confuses some people, but I think there's an onus there to get that domestic level of competition up a level, as well as allowing nations like Georgia to compete at the top table in international rugby.
Do you bring a promotion and relegation situation into that, Murray, potentially?
Yeah, down the line, like how cool would it be to have a second tier? And I know it's something that a lot of fans would enjoy. And I think there is a real interest in rugby in different countries and promoting that as well. So yeah, maybe down the line that'll be a good thing to see. But yeah, like Georgia is a great example of a nation with real potential, I think. And it is important that World Rugby, I suppose, targets certain nations. It's great spreading the game everywhere, but there's a finite amount of resource there. And sometimes it makes sense to really target certain nations like Fiji before the last World Cup. And I know it was a disappointment how maybe they didn't quite perform to the highest of their potential in that comp. But someone like Georgia, genuinely, I think, could be a real contender with a bit more resource and a bit more exposure.
Birch, we might continue on Georgia in a moment, but if I could hop back to South America for a second and pick up on what Murray was talking about with the Superliga de Americas. I think you mentioned there that Uruguay and Chile are the two countries who are probably developing the quickest in South America. Brazil have been doing okay as well in recent years, but they're also the two nations, I think, who are trying to introduce second franchises into the Superliga. So you've got Daniel Herrocade there, our old friend, former Pumas boss, is the high performance director of that league. He wants to turn it into a 10-team league eventually, but also doesn't want to dilute the quality. And they're the two countries that have put their hands up so far as potentially bringing new clubs into that competition, which is obviously a healthy sign. But if you were creating a competition like that from scratch, what's the most important thing to you as it pertains to actually developing national teams on top of it?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's the carrot of being able to go somewhere else. So obviously, the Jaguares will get bored winning that all the time. They're coming from a far better competition to start with. But I think, where can it lead you to? So I think, obviously, to bring it back to Europe again, I think I agree with Murray. I think the possibility of getting a team that could get into that Premier Division of a URC would potentially entice investment, whether that's investment from the government, like we know Georgia have very close links to the government there, or whether the owner of Stade Francais, Dr. Wild, Capri Sun tycoon, he was putting a lot of money into German rugby at the time, and there was certainly talks about potential of German involvement in the old Pro 14 around the time that the Kings and Cheetahs came in. And when that didn't happen for him, he obviously decided to buy a ready-made club in Stade Francais and a competition that's already up and running. But at his heart, he was putting a lot of money and investment and time into German rugby. So if there's a competition structure where investors or people who are willing to spend and invest, it's not really investment in rugby, but to lose money to get their team or province into a better competition and have the rewards of that obviously transfer into an international team, I think there's strong possibilities. But you have to have the competition structure. I mean, Murray's mentioned it. It's no surprise that the South American teams, the non-Argentina, who are already established, are now starting to show improvement, because there's a competition structure that allows them to play a higher level of competition on a regular-ish basis. And obviously COVID disrupted it for a while, but you can see it then transferring to the national team. So and obviously those other countries are chasing World Cup qualifications, so that's their carrot. But I think that as long as there's a chance of winning something, and that winning that is worth enough in itself, or it leads to something bigger long term, I think that will focus the mind, and that's potentially. I mean, we've been talking about there's been a lot of money spent and invested in competitions, etc. in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Spain, etc. But we haven't really seen them develop, bar Georgia, and then Georgia have struggled to actually go to that next level, to be able to really sustainably be a challenge to the established teams in the Six Nations. So but they definitely would say Georgia for sure, given the amount of the players they have in France, given that they're now starting to produce backs, given the crowds they can get, given the support they have, etc. They should be the next best, but at the moment they're blocked off. It must be very difficult for them to see where they're going, because bar World Cups, they don't have a chance at the moment because the Six Nations ring fence. So I'd like to see that open up, at least a playoff. The bottom team plays Georgia, even if it's at home for the Six Nations side, on a one-off game like in Pro D2, and then obviously I would totally agree with Murray. Some kind of a second level URC which expands the game further, and long term the potential carrot is entry to the URC, maybe through a playoff again.
Yeah. And we need to obviously talk about the Pacific Island nations, which is a really massive part of this, Gab. But just to kind of wrap on Europe, also internationally, Ireland are keeping an eye on it, because they're going to have Europe 2 in their World Cup pool, and obviously you'll expect to get a victory there. But it's interesting to see that battle. Georgia are well in front. It kind of counts over the 2 years of Rugby Europe Championship, the Six Nations B, and Georgia are 5 out of 5 this year. Portugal are sitting second at the moment, but I think Romania and Russia are still very much in the mix and will be over the next year. So that's going to be a good battle. The third European team also in that competition can qualify into the World Cup via the final qualifier tournament. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Portugal, fair play to them. They had a really talented couple of crops of under-20s a few years ago. People might have seen a little bit of them or a few clips on Twitter, and they're pushing some of those guys through. So again, you love to see those progress stories. But you want someone at the very top table. And I think that's where the Pacific Island nations come in. Like, they have that potential.
Let's chat about them then. And before we get into the eligibility rule, potential change of the eligibility rule, I should say, which realistically will most affect the Pacific Island nations, because they have produced so many unbelievable players who go off and ply their trade elsewhere. Just to talk about that neck of the woods in a structural sense as well, Murray? Obviously, we know that you've got two franchises coming into Super Rugby in the Fiji and Drua and Pacifica Moana. And like, I can't really see anything wrong with that. I hope there are no sort of like, there's no kind of negative spin. It just feels like a positive development unless you tell me otherwise.
Yeah, it's great in my eyes as well. It's a key part of the pathway, and you're seeing the squads being announced at the moment, and you know, it's all obviously Fijian players in the Drua and Tongan and Samoan players in the Moana Pacifica team. They've got good head coaches there, Leon MacDonald in charge of Moana Pacifica, and Mick the Kick in charge of Fiji and Drua. So they're putting together good teams there. They're going to play outside the Pacific Islands for this first year. Obviously with pandemic related issues and travel and all that, but you would hope to see them eventually playing their home games in those home nations. And it's massive, you know, players who would have instantly looked away to Europe and been away, and it's hard to get them back in for any sort of training camps or even the international windows, can now look closer to home. And you would imagine that'll develop over the years to come, and hopefully it's a genuine option rather than going to Europe for that big contract. You'd love to see that. Samoa obviously qualified into the World Cup. They beat Tonga over 2 legs, and really impressively, I actually thought they actually have a really exciting group coming together there. Some guys who are pretty new to international rugby but have a bit of experience around Super Rugby and that kind of thing. They've got a really good coaching ticket. Silala Mapasua's in charge, and Tanu Maga, Andrew Goodman from the Crusaders. I'm probably forgetting Mo Schwalger's there as well. And obviously Michael Alatoa, the captain now, is playing with Leinster. You can see his quality. So they're going to play against England, Japan, Argentina, and it'll be either Chile or USA. And I wouldn't be surprised to see them get a good result if they can develop. The shame now is they're not going to play these November tests. They couldn't travel over with the restrictions aforementioned. And so Tonga really have to push on in this window. They weren't able to get all their coaching team over, unfortunately, for this. So Jimmy Duffy actually is one of the guys involved, the ex-Connacht forwards coach, in their kind of makeshift coaching ticket. But yeah, you'd love to see those nations push on. Fiji obviously have been threatening and got some big results over the years, and the talent there is obviously undeniable and really thrilling. And World Rugby, as I say, have put a bit of investment into that. Fiji and Drua have played in the Australian NRC before, and now they get that chance in Super Rugby. I'm thoroughly excited by it. I can't wait to watch them play at that level.
Birch, with those two franchises joining Super Rugby, how does the competition, or how does the sport, I guess, avoid a similar situation to the Sunwolves, who were great to watch, and it felt like, again, a positive step for Japanese rugby, but didn't work out for financial reasons and so on? Do you think there are kind of safeguards in place this time around, or some kind of a safety net to prevent them from falling out eventually if the first couple of years are hairy?
Yeah, I'd like to hope that they stick with them. I think there's huge potential there. They have got good coaching staffs. You know, their budget obviously isn't as high as some of the more established teams, but I also think they'll get some players who'll go back there at the end of their careers, and then obviously to give something back, and then they'll find new talent, which is there's lots of it. It's just a case of being able to get them away from going to Europe, or get them away from going into rugby league, which is obviously becoming very attractive for them. The NRL clubs are very active in terms of their ability to scout those young talented players. Obviously a lot of Tongans go to Japan very young, 13 or 14 on scholarship. So there's a lot of people trying to, I suppose, drink out of the same trough there. But you would like to think that this is going to be a massive game changer for those countries in terms of being able to, contract players locally and have a competition structure that they're all familiar with, and some of them would have grown up, I suppose, hoping to play for a team somewhere else in this competition. So, look, it's not a financial play. I mean, it's not going to wash its face. And likewise with the Sunwolves, they needed co-investment. They needed a big investment from the Japanese Rugby Football Union. But don't underestimate the role that played in Japan, now becoming a team that's respected in World Rugby. And let's not forget where Japan came from, where, teams, I remember watching the All Blacks back in the day at World Cups, whoever played 10 that day broke the record for points scored. So, they have served their purpose in terms of bringing Japanese rugby on. And I would like to believe that these teams shouldn't be judged on financial gains or maybe big losses. It should be judged on where they can bring Tonga and Samoa in particular back to where they should be, because what they contribute to the world game is phenomenal. Fiji have been pushing ahead of the other two and have had some great success and some and could do more as well. But particularly Samoa and Tonga, I feel, will benefit from this competition, and also will benefit from the proposed eligibility laws changing if that comes into play, which it looks like it will, to be honest, which could be massive for them.
Well, stick with yourself and let's chat about those potential rule changes then, or that potential rule change, right? It feels like it feels like it's not a black and white issue where you can say, yeah, it's great, or no, it's bad, because there will be some unbelievable stories that will undoubtedly boost the squads of several of the countries that we're talking about right now in future years. On the flip side, for a country like Georgia, who we're just talking about, they might look in at some of the Pacific Island nations, for example, who probably will get some, even All Blacks potentially back at a certain stage, and think, well, you didn't even develop these players and we don't really have this option because our players aren't going and playing for other countries throughout their careers. So in a very long-winded way, I'm asking you, what are your thoughts on it generally? Like, I suppose if you have to lean one way or the other.
I wouldn't have huge sympathy for Georgia. Sorry?
No, sorry, go for it.
Sorry, Gav. I wouldn't worry about it, to be honest. And while it will make things more difficult for those, other tier 2 countries, it's the right thing to do. I mean, the Pacific Islands are producing a huge amount of players, whether they're first generation, second generation, and unfortunately they haven't had the opportunity to be able to keep them, and it's been very difficult decisions for a lot of those players to go play elsewhere, but financial needs have meant that was the best thing to do for them and their families. And just looking off the top of my head, someone like Nathan Hughes, obviously hasn't played for England for a couple of years. He could go back. Charles Piutau could go back to play for Tonga. There's countless players all over the world, particularly from those Pacific Island teams, who could go back and help them at a Rugby World Cup. And unfortunately, it's become harder for them at Rugby World Cups to have the big scalps that they were having at the start of professionalism. And I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing for promoting rugby back in those islands as well. And I'll be honest, I mean, don't take for granted that supply chain is going to keep coming into rugby union. I have a couple of friends involved in scouting in rugby league and NRL, and I mean, they are in there now, and they're in Auckland. They're in Auckland where, scouting the top private schools to take the best talent. So, and there's only so many can become All Blacks, and there's only so many can get into Europe or because of visa requirements. So, we need to do something to make, to make those countries stronger and to keep rugby union growing, I think, and they have given us so much, and we haven't probably given them enough back, to be honest.
So maybe it is actually black and white, Murray, just pretty good, or what are your thoughts?
I'm kind of veering the other way, and I feel harsh saying that, because you don't want to deny what would be brilliant for what I've just spoken about, the World Cup being so competitive. Tonga, with a number of guys that Birch has mentioned, there's loads of interest there. They'd be so competitive, they'd be so strong. I don't know, but the other part of me is there was another time when Charles Piutau really wanted to be an All Black, and obviously it's not much of a decision to make when you're grown up there and you've, I suppose, dreamed of it and the opportunities that come with it, like a move to Bristol, to Ulster, and then Bristol. But I feel like it's such an important decision in your career, and that international rugby is kind of special because you've made that commitment, and yeah, maybe it doesn't work out for some guys. It's easy for me to say because I've not been in that position of being involved and then waiting around for a couple of years and wishing I could have played for a different nation. And also then the fact that it doesn't, it works really well for some nations. Tonga, Samoa, Portugal are the ones who proposed it to World Rugby, the amendment, and they've got players in France with Portuguese heritage, and it would be brilliant for them to welcome those back and make them stronger again. But I know there are other nations like Uruguay who won't benefit from it as much, are opposed to it. So it goes to a vote. It needs 75% of the 52 votes in total, and obviously some nations and unions have a greater weight behind that vote. So I'd be surprised if it makes it beyond that vote. Probably not for the reasons that I've got concerns about it, to be honest, more for people defending their position and as we said earlier on, not really having the growth of the game in mind at all times. So yeah, fascinating to see how it works out, but I'm definitely kind of caught in two minds about what is the best for the game. Great to see Tonga with a full strength team like they could possibly have, but I understand why other smaller nations are concerned about it.
A battle of two giant rugby nations this weekend. Can I get predictions from you lads for Ireland and Japan? Starting with yourself, Murray, while you're hot there.
Yeah, I think Ireland by 9 or 10 points. Yeah, there's a nagging doubt because Japan are so exciting to watch, but I think Ireland will have enough quality there.
Birch?
Yeah, I'd be the same. I think Ireland will get it done, but it'll certainly be tetchy, and we'll be worried for a while.
Are you back on Monday with Owen, Murray?
Yeah, we're going to do a post-match update from the stadium, myself and Kieran, and we'll have a quick chat there. And then Owen will be in for in-depth analysis on Monday. Always brilliant getting his thoughts, like he sees it with that analyst's eye. So we'll be breaking the game down, key moments, and talking about the other international rugby as well. So if people want a bit more coverage, join up for the membership now. It's a great time with all the November rugby ahead.
Absolutely. 2 extra podcasts for your ears over the weekend and on Monday. Members.the42.ie to sign up there and get all of Murray's additional rugby coverage. Behind the Lines number 5 is also on sale now. www.the42.shop. That is our new book, the 5th edition. Time flies. Thank you to everybody at home for tuning in. Thank you to the two boys as well for their insight as always. Until the weekend, if you're a member, until next Thursday. If you're not, mind yourself. Enjoy the rugby over the weekend. Take it easy.